A woman named Barbara Coombs, 63 years old, went to the police to confess a horrifying crime that had been hidden for so long. According to her statement, she had killed her own father and buried his body in the backyard over 10 years ago. It all started with a mysterious box. So, what was inside that box? What could have driven a woman in her 50s to make such a brutal decision? Before we dive into today's story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our latest videos. On a chilly January afternoon in 2006, Barbara Coombs, then 51, stepped into her small house in the town of Stockport, Greater Manchester. After spending the entire morning outside in the garden, she was getting ready to plant some new trees, still holding a shovel with soil clinging to it. The quiet atmosphere enveloped the kitchen as she entered, with faint sunlight filtering through the window, casting beams across the old wooden floor. While setting her shovel aside, Barbara suddenly paused, her eyes drawn to an old wooden box lying on the kitchen table. The box looked familiar. She had seen it many times since she was a child, but every time she tried to approach it, her father, Kenneth Coombs, 87, always stopped her with a very harsh attitude. Her father had always told her never to touch that box, as if it contained a secret no one was allowed to know. But today, Kenneth had forgotten the box there, and curiosity surged within Barbara. She approached, her hands trembling as she opened the box. The moment she saw what was inside, her entire body froze, her eyes widened, and her heart pounded in her chest. The contents left her stunned. She couldn't believe her eyes. This was the very secret her father had hidden all these years. Unable to stay calm, Barbara, trembling, took the photos and walked into the living room. Seeing her father sitting there, she placed each photo right in front of him. Kenneth's face suddenly turned pale, his eyes filled with panic, and an intense argument erupted between them. Barbara demanded an explanation, but instead of answering, Kenneth tried to avoid her, only increasing her anger. Finally, in a fit of rage, Barbara lost control, still holding the shovel in her hand, and struck her elderly father hard on the head. Kenneth staggered, turning around, but only in time to take a second blow, this one even stronger than the first. In a fit of madness, Barbara used a sharp object to relentlessly strike her father, watching as he gradually lost blood until he collapsed entirely onto the floor. Blood spilled uncontrollably, staining the floor in splatters, and Barbara stood there, witnessing her father take his last breaths in agony. She stood motionless, staring at her father's lifeless body sprawled on the floor, her heart pounding, hands trembling as she struggled to face the harsh reality that had just unfolded. Taking a deep breath, she tried to steady herself, quietly pulling an old rug from inside the house, and carefully wrapped Kenneth's body in it. She dragged his heavy body out to the back garden, her eyes fixed on the large tree not far from her bedroom window, where she knew she could safely hide the body. Under the dim moonlight, Barbara crouched down and began digging a deep hole beside the tree, soil flying up with each shovel stroke, the cold clang of the spade hitting the earth, making the scene even more eerie. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Each shovel dig into the ground felt heavy, as if pulling up the harsh memories she longed to erase. When the hole was finally deep enough, she carefully pushed her father's body into it, choking back her emotions as she glanced at him one last time, then firmly packed the soil back as if nothing had happened. Barbara covered the grave carefully, pressing down each layer of earth to hide the traces of the crime she had just committed. After burying him, Barbara returned to the house, where bloodstains still marked the kitchen and living room floors. Her hands trembling, she patiently scrubbed every corner, hoping that with meticulous covering, the truth would be buried forever beneath the dust of time. She didn't want anyone to notice anything unusual, didn't want anyone to know that she had taken her father's life with her own hands. When everything was cleaned up, Barbara took heavy steps back into the living room, sat down on the couch, and buried her face in her hands, crying. She cried for her guilt, for the agony gnawing at her soul, her face contorted in pain. her eyes foggy as she stared at the mysterious box still lying on the table. That was the box containing the horrific secret, the thing that had transformed a gentle woman into an unexpected murderer. So, what exactly was inside that box? What had driven Barbara, a woman in her 50s, to such a brutal decision? The secret inside that box was the key to this crime, a secret known only to Barbara and her deceased father, Kenneth Coombs, whom all family and friends regarded as a war hero and a true gentleman. Kenneth had served in World War II, receiving several prestigious awards for his contributions during those brutal years of war. He was an incredibly calm, gentle, and intelligent man, qualities that made Kenneth the object of admiration, not only among friends but also neighbors. To them, Kenneth was a model man, always willing to help. Despite his age, he retained the demeanor of a gentleman, earning everyone's respect and affection. When Barbara announced that her father had passed away from a heart attack and that there would be no funeral, neighbors felt deeply saddened. They regretted not having the chance to say goodbye to the man they respected. They believed Kenneth deserved a proper farewell, one that honored his contributions and his life. His sudden departure, without a single farewell, only deepened the sorrow in their hearts. But none of them knew Barbara was hiding a horrifying secret. And the more frightening truth was, Barbara wasn't the only one with a secret. Kenneth Coombs, the man everyone admired and respected, was in reality not the true gentleman they thought him to be. Behind his calm and wise demeanor, he was a monster. For many years, Kenneth had hidden horrific crimes, secrets that only Barbara knew. To Barbara, her father was a very difficult and authoritarian man. He wasn't the kind, respectable man everyone believed him to be. Instead, Kenneth was a man who sought to control everything around him, letting no one escape his watchful eye and control. He created a constant tension in the family, where every action and word of others had to follow his will. From the smallest matters to major decisions, he always wanted to be the one in charge. Not only that, Kenneth was also someone who enjoyed humiliating others, putting them down to feel superior. Barbara had often been a victim of his cruel words, disdainful glances, and actions that deeply wounded her self-esteem. She grew up feeling oppressed and fearful. It wasn't just her, even her daughter, Islay, couldn't escape her grandfather's hold. Kenneth's controlling and authoritarian nature turned the lives of Barbara and Islay into an endless sequence of stifling days. Barbara endured a childhood and much of her life under the shadow of both physical and emotional abuse from her own father. The beatings and insults became a regular part of Barbara's life, and she had to endure this for over a decade. But the most terrifying aspect was not just the abuse, it was Kenneth's perverse behavior. In his eyes, Barbara was not a daughter, but a tool to satisfy his dark desires. Hundreds of times, she had to endure violations from her father, suffering both physically and mentally, with no way to escape. The height of Kenneth's depravity was reached when he took Barbara, then just a child, to a photography club. In this seemingly harmless place, he turned his own daughter into an object for depraved men. Kenneth forced Barbara to expose her most innocent and sensitive parts before the lenses of strange men. Barbara had no ability to resist, no means of escape. She could only comply with her father's arrangements, consumed by overwhelming fear and shame. It was only when she married that Barbara experienced a fleeting sense of freedom, escaping the oppressive control of her monstrous father. That marriage seemed to be the only way for Barbara to leave the home, filled with so many painful memories. Afterward, Kenneth lived with his wife, Mary, and their 3 children in a semi-detached house in southeast Manchester. But that marriage also soon fell apart. Mary left Kenneth, taking their 2 sons, and not long after, in the 1970s, she passed away. Years later, when Barbara's marriage also ended in divorce, she decided to return to live with her father, bringing her daughter along. Partly due to financial hardships, as Barbara needed a stable place to live, and partly because Kenneth was now elderly and needed care. Barbara told herself that after so many years apart, perhaps they could mend their father-daughter bond, and that Kenneth, now an old man, might have changed. However, the reality was harsher than Barbara had ever imagined. The house hadn't changed, and neither had Kenneth. Despite his age and declining health, Kenneth remained an authoritarian, refusing to relinquish his control. The days in the old house quickly turned into another nightmare, as Barbara realized time had not erased her father's cruel nature. With his vicious and perverse nature, Kenneth continued to abuse Barbara, even though she was now an adult and had returned to live with him. This filled Barbara with profound disgust, while anger and pain increasingly surged within her. She was deeply disappointed in her father, yet felt hopeless because she couldn't share her misery with anyone. To everyone around them, Kenneth was always seen as the perfect image of a devoted father, a respectable man. Barbara knew that if she spoke out, no one would believe her story, so for many years, she endured in silence. But everything changed the day Barbara discovered the horrifying contents hidden in her father's secret box. In a single moment, as the lid of the box opened, Barbara could barely contain her scream. She stared at the photographs inside the box with trembling hands, and an overwhelming fury began to rise within her. In front of her were dozens of photographs of children, including herself, captured in indecent and perverse ways. To Barbara, those photos were the final straw. She knew she could never forgive her father again. That night, Barbara's 18-year-old daughter, Islay, returned home, her face bright and carefree as always. But as she entered the house, she sensed an unusual emptiness. The house seemed more silent than usual. There was no sound of Kenneth calling her name or the familiar sound of the radio he always listened to. Instinctively sensing something was wrong, Islay immediately asked her mother about her grandfather's absence. Barbara stood there, trying to keep calm, but her eyes showed a trace of worry, and the dark circles under her eyes betrayed her lack of sleep. She reassured her daughter with a prepared lie, telling Islay that her grandfather had suddenly passed away due to sepsis. The news struck Islay like a blow, leaving her heart aching. She pressed her mother for more details, but Barbara remained silent, her eyes avoiding her daughter's questioning gaze. In the days that followed, Barbara tried to play the role of a grieving daughter. She expressed sadness to neighbors and friends, and even kept her distance from close acquaintances to avoid uncomfortable questions. Then, one afternoon, Barbara received a call from her brother, Michael. Michael's warm voice was as cheerful as always, but when he began to inquire about their father's health, Barbara felt a chill run down her spine. Michael said he wanted to visit their father that weekend to chat and reminisce about old memories. Barbara couldn't answer directly. She burst into tears and had to fabricate another story. She told him that their father had passed away suddenly from a heart attack at the hospital, and that she had decided to have him cremated immediately, explaining she wanted things to be quick so he could rest in peace. Michael, though surprised, quietly accepted his sister's explanation, believing she had done the right thing. And so, the story of Kenneth's disappearance gradually faded into oblivion. No one in the family suspected a thing, and no one knew that under the damp earth in Barbara's back garden, his body had been lying there for 12 long years. Barbara sold the house and moved far away. For the next 12 years, she lived an ordinary life as though nothing had happened. During this time, Barbara also forged her father's signature to receive his pension and other social benefits, seeing it as repayment for all she had endured. Barbara believed her evil father's body would forever remain buried beneath the earth, undiscovered, until one cold winter afternoon in 2017, when the new owner of Barbara's former home decided to renovate the garden. Since moving in, he had barely paid attention to the backyard, allowing plants to grow wild, blocking most of the pathways. Today, he decided to spend some time tidying up and giving the garden a fresh look. The man quickly grabbed his gardening tools, put on gloves, and began working. While clearing the shrubs, he noticed a tree in a secluded corner of the garden. strangely stunted and withered, unlike the lush greenery around it. Seeing that the tree was dead, the man decided to dig it up and clear the area. With the first strikes of the shovel, a chilling feeling crept over him, though he couldn't understand why. He continued his work. After some digging, the shovel suddenly hit something strange. He paused, carefully digging around it, and slowly, an old rug emerged. A foul stench wafted up, making him shudder, but curiosity drove him to crouch down and pull the rug to check. As soon as the rug opened, what he saw inside left him stunned, falling backward in horror. In front of him was a human skeleton, pale bones mixed with wriggling maggots, and a skull rolling out from inside, paralyzing him with fear. It took him several minutes to regain his composure, trembling as he took out his phone and called the police, stammering as he reported his gruesome discovery. As soon as the report came in, the police quickly arrived at the scene to collect evidence. After conducting DNA tests, they confirmed that the skeleton found beneath the soil in the garden indeed belonged to Kenneth. The detectives thoroughly examined every trace in the house and investigated the buyer, but found no suspicious signs. Thus, they quickly ruled out the new homeowner from the suspect list and shifted their investigation to other leads. The investigation proceeded urgently, with the police trying to gather any information that could lead to the identity of Kenneth's killer. But everything changed just a few days later, on January 7, 2018, when Barbara walked into the police station on her own. Entering the station, Barbara gave a slight smile and, with a strange calmness, confirmed her name, address, date of birth, and finally confessed to the crime. The atmosphere in the interrogation room grew tense and eerie as the officers sat in silence, unable to ask questions, simply listening to Barbara recount the tragic details of her life. In front of them sat a full-figured woman with white curly hair, wearing black-rimmed glasses and an innocent demeanor. She began recounting her haunting childhood years when she endured abuse and violations from her father. Leading up to the night, she decided to end it all by killing him in the home she'd known since childhood. The police were stunned to learn that this calm, kind-looking woman, a single mother battling stomach cancer, was the very person who had killed her own father. What Barbara confessed was not only a crime, but a tragic story of a life, tainted by the very man who was supposed to be her protector. In the trial held at Manchester Crown Court, Barbara admitted to her act of murder. She said she had lied to her brother, claiming their father had suffered a stroke due to heart disease and had been cremated. She then took financial advantage by forging documents to collect her father's pension and claimed guardianship of Kenneth for more than 10 years, even though he had already died. Barbara Coombs later faced a manslaughter charge and was sentenced to 9 years in prison for killing her own father, burying his body in the backyard, and keeping this secret for over a decade. Thank you for tuning in to today's true crime story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated on more captivating cases on our channel. A mother is accused of killing one of her young children and attempting to kill the other two.
At night, when I close my eyes, I can see Christy reaching her hand out to me while I'm driving. That haunts me the most.
A part of me was afraid that...
In the quiet of the night, on a desolate road, a mysterious man suddenly emerged from the darkness. Coldly, he drew a gun and, without hesitation, opened fire on the occupants of a red Nissan. The woman sitting in the car immediately opened the door and bolted out, running frantically down the empty road. Panicked, she waved her arms in the air, pleading for anyone who could help. Residents rushed to the scene in horror, shocked by the terrifying sight. Inside the car, blood had stained the seats, and 3 children lay motionless, wounded by bullets. What no one knew was that the mother's desperate cries and the cruel gunshots were part of a perfectly orchestrated scheme. Before we dive into today's story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our latest videos. At around 11 o'clock p.m. on May 19, 1983, In Springfield, Lane County, Oregon, a woman with a terrified expression drove a Nissan at high speed to the emergency room of Mackenzie Willamette Hospital. Her face was pale, and her eyes were filled with panic as she pointed towards the car and desperately told the hospital staff that an unknown man had shot her children. As soon as the car door was opened, the nurses were stunned by the scene before them. Inside the vehicle were 3 children, a 7-year-old girl, an 8-year-old girl, and a 3-year-old boy, slumped over their seats with severe injuries. All 3 had been shot at close range, with bullets penetrating their bodies, especially in the chest area, causing blood to spatter everywhere. The mother, Diane Downs, was also injured in her left arm, but her wound was not life-threatening. In her panic, she recounted that a man with disheveled hair had suddenly attacked her and her children in the car. Doctors and police arrived at the scene within minutes of receiving the report. They quickly identified the 3 children as Christy Downs, 8, Cheryl Ann Downs, 7, and Danny Downs, only 3. Sadly, Cheryl did not survive due to the severity of her injuries, while the other 2, Danny and Christy, were in critical condition. Diane Downs began recounting the horrifying story of what she and her children had just experienced to the police. That evening, after the family had dinner at home, they decided to visit an acquaintance named Heather Plord. According to Diane, they were not close friends, so she did not have Heather's phone number. However, wanting to give Heather an advertisement for a horse she was interested in, Diane decided to drive to Heather's house. After completing this task, on the way back, Diane drove down the quiet old Mohawk Road. This was a desolate road with little traffic, but Diane chose it because she knew her children enjoyed moon watching and the night scenery. As Diane was driving her children back from Heather's house in Marcola, she suddenly saw a man standing by the roadside, waving for a ride. According to Diane's description, the man appeared to be in his 20s, with white skin and about 6 feet tall. Notably, he had long, wavy black hair that almost covered his face, and a bushy beard. Thinking the man might be in trouble, Diane decided to stop and ask if he needed any help. But as soon as she rolled down the window, the horrific tragedy struck unexpectedly. The man with disheveled hair said nothing, quickly drawing a gun and aiming directly at the 3 children in the car. Without hesitation, he fired repeatedly, unloading the bullets into Diane's children. Seeing Diane trying to wrestle the gun away, he turned and shot her in the left arm. After committing the crime, he swiftly disappeared into the thick darkness, leaving Diane and her children in terror. Despite her pain and panic, Diane's maternal instinct drove her to slam the accelerator, racing towards the hospital in a desperate attempt to save her children. In the chaos, her sole focus was to get her children to the hospital as quickly as possible, even with her bleeding arm and the overwhelming fear engulfing her mind. In response to this tragic case, authorities mobilized all resources and worked tirelessly to track down the mysterious perpetrator while also dedicating themselves to saving the innocent children. Nurses and investigators at the hospital, following orders from their superiors, provided special care to Christy, one of the 2 surviving children from the horrific attack. However, Christy's condition was critical, and her chances of survival were slim, causing constant concern among the staff. The Springfield police quickly formed a specialized investigative team, issuing emergency patrol orders on all roads around the city, especially in the attack's vicinity, in an effort to capture the suspect. Authorities combed through every clue, hoping to find traces of the perpetrator. However, as the investigation progressed, the police began to develop suspicions about the mother, Diane Downs. Evidence collected from the car did not match Diane's account, and her oddly calm demeanor in the face of her critically injured children led investigators to question her story. Why did the stranger only attack the 3 children and not touch the mother? And why didn't Diane act on her maternal instinct to save her children in such a critical situation? These questions led the police to re-examine the case from a different perspective, raising new doubts about the mother, who was originally considered a victim in the story. In Diane's car, the police investigated the bullets and determined that the children were shot with either a .22 caliber handgun or a rifle. However, the police suspected with 80% certainty that a handgun was used, given the close-range nature of the wounds. Cheryl was the most severely injured because she was seated next to the car window. The blood stains on the car door, seat, window, and other areas indicated that the shooter fired from the left side, or the driver's side. The police agreed with Diane's account that the stranger reached through the window to shoot the other two children. However, the forensic examination did not match Diane's testimony. The autopsy revealed no blood on the driver's seat, despite Diane's claim that she was driving when she was injured in the arm. As a mother, Diane failed to administer first aid or stop the bleeding for her children. She only tended to her own superficial arm wound. Moreover, Diane claimed she drove quickly to the hospital to save her children, but evidence showed she drove at a very slow speed, approximately 10 kilometers per hour. A witness even reported that, rather than speeding to the hospital, Diane drove calmly, causing the witness to pass her. The strange calmness was not at all like the reaction of a mother worried about the life of her children. When the police read the report on Diane's injuries, their suspicion grew. Her injuries were merely a bullet wound to the elbow, resulting in 2 small wounds, not life-threatening. This led investigators to speculate that Diane might have shot herself to mislead the authorities and create a false story to cover up the truth. However, while waiting for more convincing evidence, the police reassured themselves that this young mother could not be so callous as to do that to her 3 children. Before the conversation with the police ended, Diane agreed to sign a consent form for a search of her home. At Diane's house, the detectives found a diary and something that piqued their interest even more: a photograph of a young man with disheveled hair and beard, placed among Diane's photos on top of the television. The police quickly discovered that the photograph was of Diane's ex-boyfriend, Robert Nick Knickerbocker. In Diane's diary, she also expressed her feelings for Nick and emphasized that he left her simply because he did not want to become a stepfather to her 3 children. At the same time, another important piece of information was uncovered. Immediately after taking her children to the hospital, Diane hurriedly called a former colleague. According to the norm, Diane should have called her ex-husband and the father of the children to inform him about the incident, not an unfamiliar man. Why did Diane not call her parents or the children's father, but instead called a colleague? The police then traced the call history to verify who Diane had called immediately after the attack. Surprisingly, the results showed that the person Diane contacted right after her children were killed was none other than Robert Nick Knickerbocker. The big question now is, who is this man named Nick? Does he have any connection to this tragic case? These clues pushed the investigation in a new direction, compelling the police to scrutinize the relationship between Diane and Nick, as well as his role in the entire tragedy. The police suspected that the heartless individual who shot the 3 children could be Diane's lover, and that she might have been an accomplice to the crime. With numerous questions raised, the police began investigating Diane's background in hopes of finding leads. Diane Downs was born on August 7, 1955. In Phoenix, Arizona. Her parents were Williadine and Wes Fredrickson, a former postal worker. Although loved by her parents, Diane never felt comfortable or free in her own life. According to court records, Diane's father had repeatedly engaged in inappropriate behavior when she was 11 years old. Diane was born a normal child, like any other, until at the age of 14, when she began exhibiting strange behavior. After entering high school, Diane began changing her style of dress, becoming more mature, dating older men, and eventually got expelled from school for moral degradation. On November 13, 1973, Diane decided to marry Steve Downs despite their significant differences. These differences eventually led them to drift apart, resulting in an unhappy marriage. Their marriage was troubled by financial instability and Diane's tendency towards infidelity. However, Diane found some solace when she became pregnant with Christy in 1974. Thanks to this child, Steve began coming home more frequently for meals with his wife. Just 2 years later, Diane became pregnant with Cheryl Lynn. After having 2 daughters, Christy and Cheryl, Steve decided to have a vasectomy as he did not wish to have any more children, aiming to provide better care for his 2 beloved daughters. Steve kept this from Diane, knowing her nature would drive her mad if she found out. However, oddly, 3 years later, Diane became pregnant again and gave birth to a son named Danny. Despite the pain of betrayal, Steve accepted Danny as his own. However, Steve's efforts to rebuild their relationship hit a dead end as Diane continued her old habits, neglecting her husband and 3 children to go out all night with other men. When Danny was 1 year old, Steve and Diane went to court for a divorce, going their separate ways, with the 3 children staying with their mother. In the following years, Diane went through many men, but she still wanted to reconcile with Steve, knowing that her ex-husband cared deeply for the children. Her 3 children were often left with their grandparents. The oldest child, Christy, at age 6, had to struggle to take care of her siblings while their mother was busy with romantic pursuits. Lacking a mother's care, the children always looked neglected and malnourished, causing great concern among the neighbors. In 1981, Diane met a man named Robert Nick Knickerbocker, and they began a passionate affair despite the man being married. Gradually, Diane became obsessed with Nick and continually urged him to divorce his wife. Despite his deep love for his wife, Nick couldn't resist Diane's seductive advances and engaged in an illicit affair with her. The two had a secret relationship for a long time. Nick observed many of Diane's flaws, noting that she was promiscuous, accepting his company while simultaneously seeing other men. As time passed, Nick felt suffocated in the relationship with Diane and decided to end it. Diane made efforts to hold on to her boyfriend but was unable to keep him. Nick also emphasized that he did not want to become a father to her children, which Diane could not accept, leading to unusual thoughts and behaviors. These changes in Diane's psychological state and behavior deepened the police's suspicion about her role in this tragic case. The police conducted a thorough re-examination of Diane's car, hoping to find new clues to clarify the case. They meticulously checked every corner, from the seats and floor to the smallest crevices in the vehicle. However, the results left them puzzled. Despite the fact that the perpetrator had fired multiple shots at the 3 children in the car, the police did not find any bullet fragments inside, which was entirely inconsistent. At the crime scene, the police only found blood from the 3 children. Apart from this blood, no additional evidence was discovered. There were no traces of bullet fragments, no signs of a struggle or altercation, and no objects or evidence that could shed more light on the case. The absence of other clues at the crime scene left the police baffled and raised many questions about the accuracy of Diane's account. As all suspicions began to point toward Diane and her performance, the police received new information from the hospital. At the hospital, after Diane had been treated and bandaged, she returned to the emergency room and received the news that little Cheryl had died from blood loss and lack of oxygen to the brain. However, it was odd that when informed by the doctors that Danny had a chance of survival, Diane remarked, "You mean the bullet only grazed the boy's heart? How could that be?" Investigators noted that typically, a mother who has just experienced such a horrific event and significant loss would be in a state of panic and profound grief. Yet, despite Diane's attempts to appear distressed and sorrowful, there were unusual signs in her eyes. She seemed to have mentally prepared herself in advance, and even appeared somewhat disappointed when hearing that her son might survive. These behaviors further convinced the police that Diane might have staged the entire event, and that she was not merely a victim but someone directly involved in the crime. At this point, Christy had survived the critical phase but remained unable to speak due to severe injuries. The investigators in charge of the case decided to allow Diane into the special care room to see the child. However, something unusual happened as soon as Diane entered the room, leading the investigators to further suspect the nature of Diane's relationship with her children. According to investigator Paul Alton, as soon as the little girl saw her mother's shadow, her eyes flashed with extreme fear. Additionally, the child's heart rate raced in sync with her mother's approaching footsteps. The investigator happened to glance at the heart rate monitor while the mother and child were talking. Strangely, Christy's heart rate spiked from 104 to 147 when her mother took her hand and told her that she loved her. Why was the child's reaction so unusual? Was she emotionally overwhelmed upon seeing her mother, or was she terrified of encountering the monster after the tragedy? Throughout the winter and into the spring of 1984, Diane quickly became the center of public attention. Although the police had not yet released any official information about Diane's crimes, the media and rumors outside seemed to have already implicitly convicted this mother. The pressure from public opinion increasingly turned Diane into a closely watched figure. While the case remained unresolved, the police decided that the two surviving children needed to be isolated and given special care, while also prohibiting Diane from accessing them. This decision infuriated Diane, who felt it was an unfair discrimination against a mother whose 3 children had been murdered. However, the police remained firm in their decision, believing it was the best measure to protect the children and conduct an impartial investigation. Eventually, after a long period of waiting and feeling pressure from all sides, Diane decided to change her attitude and expressed a desire to cooperate with the investigation. She suggested organizing a conversation to further explain the suspicions surrounding the night of the incident. Diane hoped that by doing so, she could clarify any misunderstandings and reaffirm her innocence in the face of implicit accusations from the public and the police. In this negotiation, Diane repeatedly mentioned that the perpetrator could be someone she knew. However, when the police asked why she was only now mentioning this to them, Diane was unable to explain how the stranger knew the location where the 4 of them were going and blocked their way. What was the motive for him to kill the 3 children? In response to these questions, Diane was unable to provide satisfactory answers, becoming flustered, losing her composure, and finding herself in a defensive position. At that moment, the investigative agency received information from the hospital that little Christy had survived the critical period. Even better news was that Christy could speak, although still very weak and unable to say much. Contrary to the investigators' relief, Diane, the mother who should have felt the most relieved and happy, appeared confused and somewhat fearful. The police quickly went to the hospital to meet Christy, believing that the girl would provide them with precise details of what had actually happened on that horrifying night and give them important information to solve the case. Faced with the police, Christy began to open up and talk about her family and her mother. In her initial revelations, Christy disclosed that the 3 siblings were frequently beaten and scolded by their mother, something that no one outside the family had known before. When the police asked about the incident on the night the 3 siblings were shot, the girl simply burst into tears and cried out, "Help me!" Christy's words, filled with pain and panic, clearly indicated that something terrible had happened, and Diane's previous statements were entirely fabricated. After multiple instances of encouragement and reassurance from the police, Christy finally agreed to recount the entire series of events that took place on the fateful evening of May 19, 1983. Christy described that after leaving a friend's house, Diane drove her children to an isolated area where no one was around. There, Diane abruptly stopped the car and pulled out a pre-prepared gun. In a matter of minutes, Diane shot all 3 of her children. After committing this cruel act, Diane shot herself in the left hand to create a fake injury, intending to make everyone believe she was also a victim of the attack. On February 28, 1984, after gathering sufficient evidence from Christy's testimony and the ongoing investigation, the police officially arrested Diane Downs for murder. The horrifying truth about the case was finally revealed. On May 10, 1984, Lane County Circuit Court began the trial of Diane Downs in courtroom number 3, one of the largest courtrooms in the Eugene courthouse. This trial attracted significant public attention, with a jury consisting of 9 women assigned to hear the case. Judge Foote presided over the trial. Those familiar with the case flocked to Eugene to attend the heartbreaking trial. Doctors who cared for the Downs children and the nurses present at the scene that night were important witnesses called to testify in court. Nurse Rose Martin, who was present at the scene on that fateful night, detailed the events and Diane's demeanor during those tense hours. Martin recalled that after asking the doctors about the condition of the 3 children, Diane did not seem overly concerned, even smiling and saying, "I'm not worried. I've bought a pretty good insurance policy for them." This cold statement only added to the horror and outrage of the witnesses and those present in the courtroom. Throughout the trial, Witnesses took the stand one after another and provided their testimonies. All unanimously identified Diane as the perpetrator of the heinous crime. When attorney Hughie questioned Diane about the day of the incident and why she took her 3 children to such a dark and desolate area, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew even more tense, especially when Christy, the oldest child, was called to testify. The tension in the courtroom seemed to reach its peak. Christy began to tremble as she faced her malevolent mother, and when the girl revealed that her own mother was the one who shot her and her 2 siblings, the courtroom fell silent, the air heavy with dread. Without a moment's hesitation, Judge Foote banged the gavel and declared the trial adjourned. The verdict was clear. Diane Downs was indeed the ruthless perpetrator who had callously shot her own children, committing one of the most horrific crimes in history. What made the case even more infuriating and horrifying was the motive behind this brutal crime. Diane Downs, a mother who was supposed to protect and love her children, chose to kill her 3 innocent kids simply to continue a relationship with her lover, who did not want to live with the children and was unwilling to take on the role of stepfather. To maintain the relationship, Diane was willing to sacrifice her own biological children, turning selfish love into a ghastly crime, an act unimaginable from a mother. With the crucial testimony of little Christy, by June 17, 1984, Diane Downs was charged with the murder of her 3 children and sentenced to life imprisonment. As for the 2 surviving children, they were adopted by Fred Hughie, the lead prosecutor in the case, in 1986. Thank you for listening to today's case story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to catch more fascinating cases on the channel.